Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In the ancient corridors of Jefferson High School, a century-old establishment of St. Louis, the wood of the doors creaked under the students' hands and the stained glass windows let in a golden light on autumn mornings. It was a prestigious school, where each class carried the weight of tradition, excellence, and silent expectations. Among the most feared figures in the establishment, Professor Richard Barnett, 54, commanded respect. He wasn't one to raise his voice. He didn't need to. His piercing gaze was enough to freeze an entire class. Always dressed in a dark gray suit, striped tie, and impeccably polished shoes, he embodied a certain idea of order and authority. It was said that some students, even brilliant ones, had burst into tears under his icy remarks. For 27 years, he taught physics as one learns to survive in a harsh world, with no room for weakness, no reward for insufficient effort. He often repeated, "I don't prepare students. I train capable minds." He tolerated error if it was methodical, but despised laziness, carelessness, and more insolence. For him, respect was earned. And few students, very few, dared to speak to him outside of strictly academic matters. That Monday morning in October, the air was dry, and dead leaves were piling up outside the large windows of the main building. The door to room 214 slowly opened. Amid a quiet murmur from the already seated students, a new face entered, Malcolm Evans. He was slim, a little shorter than the others, with a calm, almost too calm gait. His gaze swept the room not with fear, but with a kind of inner concentration. He wore a clean but unmarked sweater, carefully ironed beige trousers, and plain white sneakers. No jewelry, no artifice. Nothing flashy. Everything about him seemed to say, "I am here to observe." But what caught the attention of some students was the brown leather notebook that he held against him. Worn at the edges, stuffed with papers spilling out of the pages. As if he were carrying a diary, or a laboratory of thoughts. He never let go. Sitting at his desk, Professor Barnett looked up briefly. He saw it. Analyzed it. And felt no interest. A black boy, unknown. Reserved. New, perhaps a transfer from a struggling high school, as there have been many lately, as part of the school district's integration program. He looked away as quickly as he had met it. "Stand over there. Third row," he said curtly, without even pointing. The voice, firm and detached, cut through the murmurs in the classroom. That was all. No questions, no introductions, no words of welcome. Just an order. Like arranging a piece of furniture in a pre-established seating plan. But in Professor Barnett's mind, the judgment was already formed. This boy, he thought, was probably going to need strict supervision. He'd seen so many students like him, troubled kids, overprotected, excused, but ultimately disappointed. He knew nothing about Malcolm. Not his record. Not his past. Not his abilities. More, he had seen her skin color, his modest clothing, his discretion. And without even realizing it, he had put Malcolm in a box. That of average students. Perhaps hard-working. Perhaps dreamers. But certainly not brilliant. Even less dangerous to his authority. He knew nothing about him. Not yet. Malcolm Evans had experienced several moves in his short life, but this one had been the most difficult. They had left Lexington, in Kentucky, after his father, Marcus Evans, had been transferred to another factory, hundreds of kilometers away. The family had chosen to temporarily separate to allow Cynthia, Malcolm's mother, to keep her job as an intensive care nurse at a St. Louis hospital. She worked nights, slept a few hours in the morning, and got up to help Jalen, the 7-year-old brother, with his homework, would prepare dinner and then leave. Malcolm, the eldest, kept house most of the time. Their new apartment was modest, in a neighborhood undergoing transformation. Police sirens occasionally echoed in the distance, but inside the apartment was a sanctuary of silence and knowledge. The walls were covered with bookshelves, biographies of scientists, science fiction novels, encyclopedias, and old physics textbooks bought secondhand. the living room always smelled like a mixture of floor wax, coffee, and lavender. At the table, we didn't talk about television, but about the universe. "Do you think we'll ever be able to travel faster than light?" asked Cynthia, pouring Jalen some juice. "Technically no, unless you bend space-time," Malcolm replied, his eyes shining. "And that's not magic?" "No, it's general relativity." Cynthia listened to him, both amazed and worried. She knew her son was incredibly intelligent. She had known it since he was 4 years old, when he took apart an old toaster just to figure it out. Why resistances were turning red. Since that day, she had never stopped fighting to open doors for him. She had seen too many brilliant black boys crushed, made invisible, or simply ignored. Moore Jefferson High School wasn't ready for Malcolm. The establishment, although elitist, carried within it invisible social rules, implicit codes that Malcolm did not share. He didn't have the right brands, didn't master bourgeois irony, and above all, he didn't fit into the boxes. Too quiet to be charismatic. Too erudite to be popular. Too dark to be considered a little genius without suspicion. And Professor Richard Barnett, in his academic ivory tower, did nothing to help him. He began by interrupt him every time he raised his hand. Even when he gave an accurate answer, Barnett found a nuance to challenge, a tone to criticize, a method to denigrate. "Evans, do you have an idea, or do you want us to draw you a picture? It's interesting, but it's not what we expected. You read too many theories and not enough textbooks, Evans." Sometimes he would throw at her deliberately ambiguous or imprecise questions, hoping he would be wrong so they could correct him in public. This amused some students. Not out of cruelty, but out of relief, it was better that Barnett was attacking Malcolm than them. Some were snickering discreetly, others looked down, ashamed but passive. It was the unspoken law of room 214, survived the Barnett show. And Malcolm, at 15, had become its featured guest. More he never replied. He noted. He observed. He recorded. He went home, reread the lessons, looked for sources, counterexamples. He devoured research articles. He wrote commentaries in his leather notebook, the one he carried everywhere like a personal scientific journal. He resisted silently. Not out of fear, but out of strategy. Because he knew that the world didn't expect him to be just good. It had to be exceptional. Not once, always. He had no right to make a mistake. Not when your name was Malcolm Evans. Not when we had that skin color in that kind of school. Not in a class led by Richard Barnett. Winter had set in Jefferson High with a certain solemnity. The wind whistled through the frames of the old windows, and the daylight seemed paler, almost bluish. In the courtyard, snowflakes were gently accumulating on the bare branches of the maple trees, forming a white lace on the cold concrete. The students, bundled up in their coats, hurried to class, as if to escape both the cold and the weight of homework. In room 214, the silence was tense. The Professor Richard Barnett, more rigid than ever in his charcoal gray wool suit, held the chalk between 2 fingers. His gaze swept the class with a detached, almost amused air. With a slow, almost theatrical gesture, he traced a long, dense, winding equation, a combination of integrals, partial derivatives, and vector notation. It was equation on fluid dynamics in nonlaminar regime, a subject that he had not never before approached with this class. A problem that, in his own words, even my best students from last year couldn't solve. Eyes flicked up at the board. Some students frowned, others were already giving up. Even those considered gifted knew that this equation was no simple exercise. It weighs an intellectual ambush. Barnett turned slowly to his students, savoring the effect. "So," he said calmly. "Does anyone have the courage, or the audacity, to try it?" A heavy silence fell. Then he jutted his chin slightly, with that icy smile that served as his mask of authority. "Evans, this is your chance to show us if you are more than just a spectator." A slight shudder ran through the classroom. Heads turned toward Malcolm. A student at the back whispered, barely audible. "He's going to make a fool of himself." Malcolm sat upright, calmly closed his leather notebook, placed it beside his desk, and stood up. He looked neither afraid nor confident, just focused as if he had been asked to take apart an engine or solve a puzzle. He walked toward the board with slow, controlled steps. Each step seemed suspended, as if time were stretching. He picked up the chalk. His gaze, first directed toward Barnett, then rested on the complex lines of the equation. He didn't move for several seconds. He was reading. Then he analyzed. Then, without hesitation, he began. A line. Then another. He redecomposed the problem. He isolated the variables, corrected certain notations without contradicting them, he clarified. Then, gently, he introduced a variation of l'approximation de Navier-Stokes, based on a method recently read in an article in The Width, which he had printed at home after discovering it while browsing a university website. He was not copying a solution, he created new reasoning from established principles that he used iterative reasoning, adding a hypothesis, then testing it by returning it to the initial condition. He moved forward like a researcher. The class was frozen. Even the sniggering had evaporated. Only the creaking of the rusty heater dared to disturb the silence. 5 minutes later, which seemed like 50, Malcolm put down the chalk. He stepped back, wiped his hands on his trousers. He stood there, without a word. As if the problem was not personal, but just, resolved. Barnett slowly stood up from his desk. He approached the painting cautiously. Reread the lines. Reread again. A crease formed between his brows. He traced certain passages with his finger, checked equalities. He tried to find a flaw. A mistake. A naive shortcut. He found none. None. The solution was not only right. It was elegant. Rigorous. Carefully considered. And, worse for her ego, it offered a perspective he himself had never considered. He felt dizzy. He felt a heat rise in his throat. Not anger. Imbalance. He straightened up, staring at Malcolm. Who helped you? He asked, his voice harsher than necessary. Malcolm blinked slowly. His gaze remained calm. He seemed neither offended nor flattered. Nobody, sir, he said simply. I read a lot. And I experiment in my garage. Not a trace of provocation. Just the truth, naked, immutable. That night, Richard Barnett did not sleep. He went to bed at 10:15 p.m., as always, in his immaculately tidy house in the Maplewood neighborhood. The ticking of the wall clock punctuated the silence, but his mind refused to settle. Lying on his memory foam mattress, arms crossed behind his head, he stared at the ceiling in the darkness. He reviewed the equation. Every symbol. Every transformation. Every line written in that calm, young hand, with a confidence that was anything but arrogant. It wasn't a fluke. It was clear, profound, mature reasoning. And above all, he saw again Malcolm's gaze. Not defiant. Not jubilant, just, peaceful. As if he had nothing to prove. As if knowledge itself was enough. Barnett sighed. A cold sweat crept down his back. How could I have been so wrong? He stood up, put on his bathrobe, went down the creaky wooden stairs, and turned on the lamp on his desk. He opened his laptop and accessed the Jefferson High academic portal. The top, Evans, Malcolm. And there, the ground gave way beneath his feet. IQ of 154, revealed during admission tests. Winner of the Lexington Regional Robotics Competition, 2021. Special mention in algorithmic engineering at the Kentucky Science Fair. Recommended by 2 universities, Stanford and Georgia Tech, for advanced programs in experimental physics. Volunteer in a school support club for struggling students. Barnett stood frozen. Everything he thought he saw, or rather, what he had refused to see, was there, black and white. He hadn't just misjudged. He had been blind. Not through ignorance. But through his biases, his reflexes, his arrogance. He closed the computer. and sat in the dark for a long time, staring blankly. The next morning, he entered the classroom as usual, punctual, impeccable suit, impassive air. But something had changed. He said nothing to Malcolm. Not a word. Not an apology. Not a compliment. More, he was now observing him. And what he saw only widened the inner fracture. Malcolm continued to excel. He answered questions accurately. He posed advanced hypotheses with a vocabulary that often surpassed that of his classmates. But he wasn't looking neither recognition nor revenge. He wasn't looking for anything. One day, between classes, Barnett left the staff room early. He saw Malcolm in the hallway, crouching next to a first-year student, a boy who was clearly overwhelmed by a math assignment. Malcolm was holding a pencil and drawing a diagram on the back of a notebook. "See, it's not that you're bad. It's just that you've learned to remember, not to understand. Look, think of the slope of a mountain. That's what a derivative is." The little boy nodded, fascinated. Barnett stopped, hidden behind the corner of the wall. He listened. He didn't dare intervene anymore. He saw him explain. Clarify. Encourage, with patience. With natural gentleness. With pedagogy. So this is what I could have been, if I had not confused authority with superiority, think Til. This boy he had despised, humiliated, reduced to a stereotype, embodied everything a teacher should be. Not domineering. Not a judge. More light passer. And in the silence of that corridor, Barnett felt his mask crack. Not all at once. More by cracks. Spring had arrived on Jefferson High School like a sweet promise after a long and busy winter. The cherry trees in the central garden were in bloom, and the warm light flooded the corridors, giving the tired walls a more human hue. It was the day of the annual academic merit ceremony, a prestigious, anticipated, ritualized event. Parents, teachers, and board members gathered in the main auditorium, a renovated old theater with crimson curtains and gold moldings. The students sat in their uniforms, impatient, stressed, some mentally rehearsing their speeches. At the back of the room, Cynthia Evans, in a nurse's coat, was holding her little one's hand. Jalen, who dangled his two short legs over the edge of his chair. His gaze never left the stage, his heart swelling with pride. On stage, the awards were paraded: Best Average, Progress in Mathematics, Team Spirit. But suddenly, an announcement interrupted the silence. And this year, the Prix du Young Innovator returns to Malcolm Evans. A round of applause rose up, spontaneously, followed by a second movement. People stood up. First some classmates. Then teachers. And, finally, parents he didn't even know. Malcolm slowly walked onto the stage. He was wearing a crisp white shirt, dark trousers, and, as always, his leather notebook in the inside pocket of his jacket. He wasn't smiling excessively. He seemed calm, whole, deeply present. He spoke. His voice was clear, calm, but trembling slightly at first. "I dedicate this award to my mother, Cynthia Evans, who works nights so her children can dream during the day. She taught me that knowledge is not a weapon, but a form of resistance. She taught me to read the stars when the world closed its doors to me." A murmur of emotion ran through the room. Then he added, looking tenderly at his little brother. "And I dedicate it to Jalen, my little brother. I hope to be for him what I haven't always had, a role model. Someone who shows that you can be different, brilliant, and still be gentle." The applause was even more intense. Some students had tears in their eyes. Even the principal discreetly wiped his eyelids. The most unexpected moment came after. A figure stood up in the background of the stage. A straight, but hesitant figure. Professor Richard Barnett. Everyone froze. He climbed the steps slowly, as if carrying an invisible burden. His face was pale, tense. He stood next to Malcolm, then stepped toward the microphone. His hands were shaking a little. Just enough for those in the front row to notice. He took a deep breath. "He speaks to you. For years, I believed my mission was to teach. That the knowledge I imparted was enough to make me a good teacher. I thought that by imposing discipline, I instilled rigor. That authority was the path to excellence. He paused. There was total silence. But this year, a student proved me wrong. A student showed me that humility is the first step towards true education. Let intelligence not shout. Let it illuminate. And let it come from where we too often refuse to look. He slowly turned to Malcolm. Malcolm, you taught me what I never learned at Harvard, or in any of my textbooks. You taught me that greatness does not make noise. It acts. Then, in a slow, almost ceremonial gesture, he held out his hand to her. Malcolm hesitated for a second, then hugged her. But Barnett, in a sincere gesture, briefly pulled her against him, in a sober, modest, but deeply human embrace. And there, the room rose. In silence. One by one. Some with clasped hands. Others, with moist eyes. There was no speech stronger than this gesture. In that brief suspended moment, the roles were reversed. The professor bowed. The student had raised. And an entire community had witnessed, not just a success, but of our conciliation between truth and humility. 10 years later, Malcolm Evans has become a key figure in the scientific world. He now works as applied astrophysics researcher at Stanford University, where he heads a laboratory specializing in gravitational simulations and cosmic structures. But even more than his discoveries, it issues public interventions that leave a lasting impression. He travels around the world, Tokyo, Nairobi, Geneva, Atlanta, Accra, Berlin, carrying his voice beyond equations. Wherever he goes, he doesn't just talk about black holes, dark matter, or galactic expansions. He also talks about resilience, identity, and silent justice. In each of his lectures, when asked what led him there, he tells a story. I was a child who was looked at askance, he said. I spoke too little. I read too much. I liked circuit boards more than football. And I was judged. Very quickly. Very badly. But I understood, one day, that you can't control the way others look at you, only what we make of it. He said these words without bitterness, but with disarming lucidity. And often, young people in the audience are crying. Because they recognize each other. From time to time, in his mailbox, a discreet message appears. Always with a sober object, quick question, or, thank you for your last article. These are messages from Richard Barnett. He's now retired. He lives in a small house near a lake in Missouri. He rereads books he'd never opened. He's interested in compassionate teaching. He writes, too. Long emails to Malcolm. Sometimes to ask scientific questions. Sometimes to recall a memory. Sometimes simply to say, I'm still learning, thanks to you. Their relationship has changed, the student became a mentor. The master, a man in reconstruction. There is no longer any hierarchy. Only a shared truth, that of two men united by a meeting that changed everything. One autumn day, Malcolm received an invitation. The school Jefferson High invited him ask guest of honor for the new promotion ceremony. He accepted, with a discreet smile. When he arrived, the room hadn't changed. The red curtains. The moldings. The same smell of varnished wood and old paper. But he was no longer the same 15-year-old boy. He went on stage, greeted the students and teachers, and spoke. He spoke of perseverance. Of inner silence. Of being out of the ordinary. And he ended by saying, don't let anyone define your limits. Even those who have power over you. The most dangerous limits are those we end up believing to be true. At the end of his speech, as the audience dispersed, a young black boy approached. He was wearing an oversized shirt and a worn school bag. But what caught Malcolm's attention was the brown leather notebook that he held against him. Identical to the one he used to wear. The boy looked up shyly. Do you think I can do it too? He asked, his voice trembling, almost guilty for daring to hope. Malcolm is pissed off. He saw that fragile spark in her eyes, the one people often try to extinguish in children like him. He placed a hand on her shoulder. You are already succeeding. You're curious. You're here. And you're asking the right question. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. Not even you. The boy nodded, his eyes shining. Then, slowly, he sketched a smile. A real one. A first. That evening, as I left the auditorium, Malcolm looked at the scene one last time. Where he had stood 10 years earlier. Where he had been judged, tested, and then recognized. And he knew, deep down, that the circle was complete. But the story was only just beginning, for someone else.